Hello.
It's been a while.
Has it?
Yeah, I think it might have been a little bit of a while at this point.
Yeah.
Yeah, spring is busy for us. It's funny, we were just talking earlier about something that happened earlier in this season, and Dave told me that when we recorded the anthropology-based episode, it was March of last year, early March.
Yeah, the third episode of The Dawn of Everything.
Yeah.
By March 8th of last year,
Yeah.
We were already 3 episodes in. So we've been doing this for over a year.
It's taken
over a year.
It's taken a while.
Yeah.
I'm excited about these last couple of chapters to talk about them, and we do have some other episodes planned to go along with this ending as we wrap up the book.
We are wrapping up the book. I know. But we do, I don't want to say too much, but we've got some bonuses.
Yeah, coming
that
up.
We're working on. We're working on.
We can't promise they're going to come out every 2 weeks, though. I'll tell you that much.
Because we know y'all want more. You want a year of content is not enough. Yeah.
Well, when it comes once a month or so, it doesn't maybe feel like a year of content.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, we haven't really taken up too much of your time, I hope.
No. So yeah, it's spring here, but it's also kind of cold on and off. We had snow this week. Just giving you guys a scene report. Mm-hmm. The wood frog tadpoles are active and busy, and our spring ephemerals are coming up.
Yeah, the greening is well underway. It's nice.
The tree flowers are so beautiful. Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting that we started this a bit over a year ago because this chapter is called Full Circle.
Oh, right.
No, it's bringing us home.
Full circle of the year.
Full circle of the year. We're back.
From where we started, yeah.
And the Davids spend some time at the beginning of the chapter summarizing the book, but we're going to return to Turtle Island to talk about the indigenous critique and indigenous culture, and they are going to share some theses around the development of social structures here on Turtle Island.
That's right. This is chapter 11. It's called Full Circle. The subtitle is On the Historical Foundations of the Indigenous Critique. So yeah, as Janet was talking about, this chapter, so, this is the last chapter proper of the book. After this is the long conclusion chapter.
Which kind of feels like its own book in a way, but yes.
Yeah. So this is very cool. The first time that I read this book, I was like, ooh, I didn't see this coming. And they really like pull, because the book is ranged all over time, all over the world, all these, we're talking about farming now, we're talking about cities, we're talking about the Stone Age, the Ice Age, all this stuff. And then, but they do manage to pull not all the threads, but some of the threads back together here into this full circle return to what was the subject of chapter 2, I believe, of the book. And that is the indigenous critique of European society that was documented most notably in this book by the discussions between the French and the Wendat diplomat Candiaronk. Right. So you probably remember all of that. And they're reminding us of this like really incisive, brilliant, well-argued critique of European society and like the misery and the unfreedom that existed there, that was put forward by the indigenous people, especially of the Iroquoian sphere on Turtle Island. And they're returning to this and kind of putting forth the question, why did these people have these ideas?
Yeah, that's right.
Right? Mm-hmm. Because they're not fans of Rousseau. Right. They're not going to just assume that because these folks like lived in a state of nature or something, that they naturally had egalitarian ideas or whatever, just by virtue of them being like
innocent,
closer to the earth or something, or less civilized, or having less technology or something like that, right? That's antithetical to the viewpoint of this book. Right. And so they ask, well, if their viewpoint did not follow naturally from these facts of their existence, then where did it come from?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that is the main question, is what is the history of these people thinking this way? And they want to propose that there is a history behind it.
Right. Well, and they also want to argue that the indigenous critique did not emerge because of contact with Europeans.
Right.
That they already had ideas around social structure and experience with different forms of hierarchy.
Yeah, right. That they didn't just form these ideas by contemplating European culture.
Right.
Right. Yeah, that's also true. That's true. They want to introduce another factor.
Right.
And this factor is basically the social and political history of Eastern Turtle Island.
Yes.
The Eastern Woodlands, all of it. So we're going to get to it here in a second, but it's actually, there's a breathtaking aspect to this chapter for me. Definitely the first time I read the book, and it even comes through on the second reading, which is like, oh, they're actually going to just tell the history.
Right.
They're going to tell like 1,000-year history of political developments and social formations, and they're going to tell it up to the point of European contact and beyond.
Right.
They spend the first several pages of the chapter kind of setting the table for getting into this history.
Right.
And they actually like reprise a lot of the arguments and points of debate and stuff that they've put forward previously in the book already. And, you know, there's only a couple things that I want to note here about all of that, because they summarize a bunch of stuff and they don't really do it any better than they've done it in the past.
We've already talked about a lot of it.
Some of the same kind of problematic points and methods of argumentation that they've engaged in, they just trot them back out again, kind of. But one of the more interesting things that they do is they bring in James Scott. So James Scott is the author of Against the Grain, and I did a little profile of Against the Grain.
You gave us a book report.
A little book report when we were having our halftime break. I think that episode came out about half a year ago or something. And James C. Scott's book, Against the Grain, is set in Mesopotamia at the time of the dawn of agriculture and the beginning of the earliest states. And you can go back and listen to my episode about that if you've not read the book. It's a great book. It's a fun read. It's very readable. It's not that long. He kind of has a theory about how grain agriculture in certain specific conditions, in a certain place, at a certain time, led to the creation of these states, early monarchies. The section in The Dawn of Everything here is called In Which We Consider James C. Scott's Arguments About the Last 5,000 Years and Ask Whether Current Global Arrangements Were, in fact, Inevitable. There's two things that I want to note about this. One of them is, you know, they sort of pretend to take the opposing point of view to their own. The opposing point of view being the person who thinks that all of this complication that they're trying to introduce into history is just missing the point, because even if it took farming a little longer to take hold, isn't what's important that it did take hold everywhere anyway?
Yeah.
And even if states, you know, had all of these kind of complicated beginnings and that there was a lot of revolutions against them in the early days and stuff, isn't what's important that states dominate the globe now?
Right.
And so there was just this trajectory, you know, towards all these things. And they actually like word a lot of these questions in a pretty accomplished way. You know, that makes you think like, oh, they've actually thought about this.
And the reader might be like, yeah,
these are good points. These are good points.
I've also
right?
had these questions.
Yeah, right. I mean, that's kind of what I mean, is that they're posing the questions in a way that they're not trying to make the question seem
stupid. Right.
They're actually posing the questions in a smart enough way that they seem to require a response. But instead, they don't actually respond to the questions, really. They talk about James Scott's book. They talk about his theories about grain and the early states and why grain in particular of all the crops. Anyway, you can go to James C. Scott's book or to my episode about that. And then at the point where they would be like, so what does this all mean? And what was the influence of grain or whatever? At the point where those questions are really ripe, they swerve, partially because James Scott also swerves, to talk about the golden age of the barbarians at the end, where part of what Scott is saying is he's like, well, you know, so these states became more and more numerous and their populations became bigger and bigger, you know, hitched to grain agriculture. And this was a trend that you see happening. But what it also set off was the growth of these types of cultures that were nomadic and would raid the grain states on horseback. And they just lived really well off of the riches that they obtained from being predators on the settled agricultural grain states. So even though the grain states were happening and they were, you know, increasing their power and they were growing in size, it also allowed for this freer way of life to sort of blossom and become very rich by being like a parasite on the grain states.
Right.
And this is all very interesting.
Oh, it's definitely. This
Super
part is really
interesting.
Yeah.
This whole thing about the golden age of the barbarians. And then where Scott's book ends, he's basically like, but even the golden age of the barbarians had a limited lifespan, and eventually the states would even subdue them. Game over, or like book over. But the Davids are just like, yeah, but Scott's book isn't even about the states. It's about the barbarians. Yeah. Next section.
Right.
You know? So it's not that I don't think all this is interesting. It's very interesting, but they build you up to make it sound like they're finally going to like square down, like face to face with the sort of hard questions that have been implied within the book this whole time, and that are, you really wish that they would take their prodigious minds and research and stuff and apply them to, and then they just sort of swerve and don't pick them up.
Well, can I talk about the barbarians for a second?
Oh, yeah.
I think this part is really interesting, and it's definitely a derailment. They're using it in a funny way, but it is interesting to think about that twinning between the grain states and the barbarians and how they kind of take turns being more prominent. And the existence of the barbarians depends upon the raiding of the grain states, although raiding cultures, as we've seen throughout the book, are also a constant. When there are sedentary cultures, there will be raiding cultures, you know. And sometimes sedentary cultures are raiding cultures, depending on the place and the culture. But part of what this part made me think about was that actually what they see as a period of power trade-off between the grain states and the barbarians, I can see, when looking at this history, an actual like intensification and consolidation of state power in the grain state with the barbarian as a foil and as an excuse.
Yeah, like, we need to protect you from the barbarians.
We have to protect you from the barbarians.
Yeah.
The barbarians are threatening you and your women, and there's only one answer for this, and it's the safety of the state. It's fortification, it's militarization, kill them first before they kill us.
Yeah.
There's only one way we can all live through this and survive together, and it's through the subjugation of the citizens under a strong state.
Yeah.
And so to me, this is the story of how we became dominated by states around the world.
In part. Yeah.
You know?
Right. No, that's a good point. Like, to what extent did the existence of the barbarians, which were created partially by the rise of the states, feed back into the increasing power of the state, even though the barbarians were sapping energy from the state, right? I mean, it's all complex and very dynamic.
I mean, we see this all of the time today. Like, it's the hysteria around immigration. These are the barbarians at the gate. This is this, even though they're not literally here to loot and raid us. This is the way it's being told to us.
Yeah, right.
To the electorate as we prepare for this heinous election in the fall.
Yeah, right.
Politicians will literally talk about these outsiders coming in, taking your stuff, taking your place, and taking your women. I mean, literally, they use the same language.
Yeah, but it's even used in like internal politics.
Absolutely,
or something,
of
too.
course.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, the barbarians are with us.
Right. Yeah, right.
They're all around us.
Because the gates are everywhere.
They should be. If we lived in a good world, every place would be gated. Yes.
The gates are everywhere. The metaphorical gates are everywhere. Before we move off from this section, I've got a hot take that I want to deliver.
Is it a hot take?
It is. It's that, okay, they start off this book by being like, we want in this book to ask what we think are more interesting questions than the questions that are commonly asked about the human story. And, the question that they most vocally reject is, what are the origins of social inequality, right? We think that there are more interesting questions than what are the origins of social inequality. So let's be more interesting and write a more interesting book. My hot take is that, I think that the question of whether current social arrangements were inevitable is a boring question. I am bored by that question, especially at this point in the book where they've raised the inevitability specter so many different times. I think it's boring because it's for one thing, it's not hard to make a case against inevitability.
Sure. Because
inevitability is such a very specific thing to try and prove. It can't happen any other way. And as they say in the book, a lot of times, it's just, you can't really prove one way or the other whether history could have gone a different way. Right. And so the whole question about inevitability or not and stuff, I think it's just a boring question. But it's the one that they keep raising. They're now we have proved that it's not inevitable. And I think that a much more interesting question, to use their rubric, what's an interesting question? A much more interesting question is what are the factors and the conditions and the preconditions that set the stage for, allow for these different historical developments to take place? And what can we say about the influence of all of these various conditions? And what can we learn about all of the variables that are in play?
Right.
And to me, that's the interesting question. And it's not a question that will ever have a definitive answer, which I think makes it an interesting question. That's my hot take.
I hear that. And yet, I will say that when you have people, there's so many social theorists, thought influencing people out there right now who are just constantly going back over these inevitable stories of when things went wrong,
right.
When we lost the thread, when we lost the narrative, right. When we lost, was it writing? Was it agriculture? These things that they're talking about, I do think it's boring, and yet all of these people are shouting about it all of the time. The amount that we have to hear the reinforcement of when things went wrong in a way that feels completely disempowering by so many people who want to speak towards liberation and collective liberation is incredible.
Yeah, there are plenty of people out there who have this vulgar inevitability conception of the human story. And this book is meeting that type of discourse at its most vulgar point.
That's fair.
It is meeting, the most obtuse part of the discourse, on its own terms.
Yeah. What you're talking about is true. They're meeting people at that point. And also, whether it's part of the sloppy deconstruction or demolition, that's what you called it, or part of just trying to get to the goal here with the book, the point of the book, I'm not sure, but it's true that they enjoy arguments that are easy to win.
Yeah, I think so.
And
that's maybe part of why I'm this is not as interesting as it could be, because you're making it easy for you to win the argument.
Right. But while, we keep trying to complicate this throughout the book and say, okay, what's a precondition, whether or not it's inevitable?
Right.
And again, that would be the case here. And as I was saying about the Barbarians, one might even argue that the back and forth with the Barbarians was a precondition to total consolidation of power. It certainly helped with it,
Yeah.
Instead of it being look at this liberating time where there was also barbarians in power,
Yeah, although, and we don't have to adjudicate that. But to say it was a precondition is to say that the consolidation of power couldn't have happened if that hadn't happened. Right. And so, are we going to say that? I don't know.
I would say it's helpful. I think it helps people consolidate power to have an enemy.
Yeah, it's a help. There's all these, we could, sidetrack into a whole different podcast here and be there's a taxonomy of different levels of sort of causality.
Right.
It helped to consolidate power. That's one. It was a precondition for the consolidating power. Now you're saying it
had to happen.
Necessary. Blah, blah, blah. There's all this stuff. And, but these are, to have those kinds of conversations is maybe the more subtle type of debates than this book is trying to have.
But they might still be boring, so we don't have to have them.
Yeah. They might still be boring. So one more little critique that I want to insert here just before we leave this section. I promise that we're going to get to the fascinating history of Turtle Island next. But they trot out so much of this, pre-argumentation stuff in here that it just comes like one thing after another. And one thing that I've been thinking this whole book long that I've always been a little dissatisfied with, they have a very good critique of the evolutionary framework of the development of human society, right? Where it begins with bands and then it proceeds to tribal societies and then, it becomes more complex. And then you have something that anthropology calls a chiefdom. And then you have something like states or whatever, right? And that this is the evolutionist framework. Mm-hmm. And they spend a few pages here, which I'm kind of surprised that this actually made the edit, right? Because it doesn't seem very important to what they're trying to do, but they actually are like, let's, for the record, lay out what this taxonomy is trying to be. And they actually define band, they define tribe, they define chiefdom, and then they define state. Because this is like one of their big bad kind of enemies in the book is this taxonomy that they associate with the evolutionist framework, which they're like, always want to remind us was invented by people who wanted to put indigenous people in their place. Right. So that it was a conservative backlash against the indigenous critique. I mean, all of this. But there's one little morsel of anthropology that I learned, which I actually learned from the What is Politics podcast from Daniel. I mean, so I just learned it from him, but it just is this little grain of sand in what the Davids are trying to do. And it's just because what the Davids do here is that they define band and tribe and chiefdom, but it's for the purpose of just like crumpling up the categories and discarding them. Right. And so they don't have any interest in making it sound like
reasonable.
They represent anything real or worth actually thinking about. So they make the categories sound a little bit ridiculous. But the thing that What is Politics podcast pointed out about the difference between bands and tribes and why anthropology has different categories for these two types of culture are that like a band is a group of people that you don't have formal membership in. Mm-hmm. A band it's just who you happen to be hanging out with at the time.
It's not even kinship.
It's not even kinship. Right. A band is not a kinship group. A band is just who you're hanging out with at the time. And people just change bands if they want to throughout the course of their life, and they're hanging out with these people now, they're hanging out with these people now. That is a band, right? But then tribes come about once people need to organize collective property. Mm-hmm. So the collective property might be some herds of animals, maybe with some grazing grounds attached to them, or maybe a certain area of the coast or the lake in which you fish. That is the domain of your tribe. There becomes a system for like how the places to fish are like fairly divided up between different subgroups inside the community. And the subgroups are the tribes. And I should say that when I say tribe, in this context, it's not really tribe in the sense of like the Native American tribes that we know from these times, like the Cherokee tribe or, the way to think about it is more like the 12 tribes of Israel, where there are like the Israelites and they are composed of 12 tribes.
Got it.
Right? It's like that sense of tribe where there are multiple tribes within a people. And this is what anthropology means by tribal organization.
Right. Okay.
Not the way that word was implied colonially to the people of North America.
Right.
Okay. So just to clarify that.
Great.
If you're born into a tribe, then that is part of your identity. You can leave and go away for 20 years, go to another land, and then come back and you still have a right to like that zone to fish because you were born into that tribe. And that is part of what these categories are designed to capture. Is changes in ways of life like that. And there's something that feels substantial in that type of description that makes me wonder what babies are getting thrown out with the bathwater if we just discard all taxonomy.
Right. Right, for sure. And what's the purpose of that? discarding all of it.
Yeah.
Because, clearly you can use those different categories outside of an evolutionary framework, right? I mean, what someone could be part of a band, a number of bands over the course of their life, different bands, also be part of a tribe, and then maybe be part of other categories within the system of taxonomy as well.
Yeah, right.
And so if you can be part of all of them at one time, how is it evolutionary?
Yeah, I see how putting these categories in an evolutionary sequence is
wrong,
inaccurate and wrong, but do the categories outside of an evolutionary framework retain any power to like help us understand people? I mean, I think that there are probably lots of arguments against this particular taxonomy of band, tribe, chiefdom, and I'm sure that I would be convinced by a lot of those arguments. So I don't want to go on the record as defending these exact categories. The anecdote that I just told about bands versus tribes or something just makes me think about, is there still a valid basis for thinking about these different structures of life kind of differently and having different concepts for them?
Right.
Yeah.
And do they provide,
even if they're not these concepts,
meaning?
Yeah.
Can they be elucidating in how we think about
things? Can they be elucidating? Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, I've kind of been holding on to that thought from the very beginning of the book, because of that potential important material difference between what are called band societies and what are called tribe societies.
Well, it kind of reminds me of how earlier in the season we were talking about how they really hate subsistence categories, but they're actually quite meaningful when we actually talk about the quality of one's life and how it's organized.
Yeah.
That like we can get something from it. We don't have to reduce everything to it, but it doesn't mean it doesn't have anything to tell us about a life.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. It relates to that.
Right.
For sure.
So before they pivot from summarizing the book up until now and laying the groundwork for their thesis to actually moving towards talking about the history of the eastern woodland peoples of Turtle Island, they spend just a moment talking about the more homogenous history of Eurasia and the cultures of that region, that mega continent.
Or like interdependence,
right?
Yeah,
because there was contact between so many peoples,
right?
Even across that massive amount of land. And what you see when you study the history of that megacontinent is that there's a commonality. There's not isolated peoples who had different ways of doing things from anyone else, because there was an obvious exchange of information, exposure to each other. Who talks about the Axial Age?
I can't remember.
I can't remember either. But there's this idea that Axial Age, in which in at least like 3 major points of empire, you see certain kinds of philosophical thought evolve at the same time. You see coined money show up. What else comes with that?
So those are the main things, but this is, for those who've read Debt, this is a familiar idea too. But in Mesopotamia, in China. And in Greece.
Right.
Is that right?
Yes.
I think that those are the 3 points. But within a 200-year span, you saw the rise of coined money, standing armies?
Right, that's
maybe,
right. The army's the other part.
Soldiers that were paid with money. And it also happened to also be the rise of the major speculative philosophical traditions that are still in the world today, like Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, and pre-Socratic Greek philosophy?
Yes.
Or Socratic? I'm not sure. But yeah, all kind of got booted up in this same period. And so that is an example of what they say is that Eurasia kind of has to be thought of as one place.
Right.
It's kind of like one interconnected system. And, the point of pointing that out is to say that it's really hard to talk about how things could have gone or what the potentials are otherwise than this one way that things went. Because if this whole landmass was like a co-implicated sort of system where there was lines of communication and influence all the way from, China to North Africa and all of this, then like what would be the exceptions that would show you another way that things could go? Yeah, because they're trying to they're still talking about like what we can learn from history. And they're like, well, maybe yeah, it's true that there was a trend toward states with greater power throughout this entire area, but that doesn't prove that there will always be a trend toward states with greater power, because maybe all these places were just influencing each other and driving each other's processes.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, which is such an interesting idea.
Yeah.
Because we think of a lot of these cultures as very separate, and I know that there's a Western bias towards thinking of China as like very isolated and separate, but actually there was quite a bit of exchange still happening.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So because they're like, well, we can't really look to this whole conglomeration for exceptions or for ways of being divergence, because there was a very interconnected zone of influence across this massive continent. They're like, we can look to another place that was actually separated by the ocean, which is the Americas. Turtle Island specifically is what they're going to be highlighting here in this chapter.
Yeah.
But they're like, here's a system that wasn't, or systems that evolved on their own.
Yeah, right. And they do point out that, there has always been some contact between the Americas and the rest of the world, but not substantial to the point that you feel like the Americas just paralleled the history of Eurasia all the way back or something.
And you can even just see that with it being the cultures being on a pretty different timeline,
Yeah, that's right. Like the timeline of crop domestication, the timeline of the emergence of empires and stuff. It's all pretty off from the European timeline. Yeah. Or not the European, but the Eurasian timeline. Yeah. Right. So that's the pivot, is that they're like, well, if we're looking for evidence one way or the other about how history could go, if we're looking for counterexamples or examples that confirm that all history trends towards states and domination or something, we can look at the Americas and see if we find that to be the case or not.
Right.
So let's go there now. Right. So yeah, that's what they do. All right. So now we're going to get into the history. There's a lot of episodes along in here, and we're going to try and keep our summaries concise enough that you can follow, the thread that they're trying to draw through here. But each one of these points in history is like a fascinating study in its own right, really. And the way that this is portrayed is like a series of developments that basically led to Candy Aronk.
It's true.
Right?
Yeah, that is kind of how it is.
This is what set Candy Aronk up to be so smart. Okay. And they take this back. Okay. So the entry point for their conversation here is, again, the clan system of Turtle Island. And this has come up before in the book. It's come up, I think that we have mentioned it before in the podcast, but where there still exist,
Yes.
And it goes back. What they're saying here is that it seems to go back at least to this Hopewell period of a couple thousand years ago. Right. That there are these clans. They're all named for animals.
Yes.
Right? Deer, bear, wolf clan. There's a bunch. And that these are indigenous societies that seem to like transcend what we now know of as tribes, or like whatever kind of social groupings of people that have changed throughout time. Those are more ephemeral and changeable compared to these clans.
It's so wild.
The clans have persisted in some form for a couple thousand years.
Across the continent.
Right. Even though, tribes have like broken up, migrated, formed into different sized polities and groupings. There have been towns, there have been not, and like all this stuff, and the clans have persisted. This is the way that I kind of understand this, at least.
Right.
Somebody correct me if I'm wrong. But they kind of ask the question of like, well, how did this get started? And if I'm following this correctly, they hypothesize that maybe its origins lay in this period and this formation that is known to anthropology as the Hopewell interaction sphere.
Yeah, the Hopewell interaction sphere is fascinating to study. The time frame we're looking at here is basically around like 100 before the Common Era to 500 Common Era. So that around 600 years is visible in the archaeology. So that's this is way pre-European contact.
Oh, yeah.
So everything that's known, although there is some oral history that persists, most of what is known has been learned through studying the archaeological sites.
Yeah.
So just to place us in that. And there are many impressive archaeological sites.
Mm-hmm.
The sort of central or part that this sphere of influence radiates out from is the Ohio River Valley.
Yeah.
Which, how far north does that go?
Some of the most famous Hopewell sites are in Ohio.
But I mean, is that the northernmost point? Or that's what I was trying to, or like, I was just realizing that I don't actually know where the Ohio River Valley.
Yeah, good question. How far up does the Ohio River go? I mean, it goes along the border of West Virginia.
Right.
And up Pennsylvania-ish.
Right.
That's kind of where I think of it.
Right, for sure.
Coming from, oh my God, my ignorance is showing here.
Right.
But then it flows down into the Mississippi.
Yeah, it flows down to the Mississippi.
At the southern tip of Illinois and everything. Yeah.
And a lot of what we're going to be talking about are the story of rivers and river cultures here. But the main sites that I first learned about, and some of the more prominent sites, are in Ohio. It's what is now called Ohio. Yes. But the Ohio River Valley itself was the central trunk of this culture.
Right.
And so what we see spread out within the sphere of influence are these impressive, gigantic earthworks, mounds, very big mounds that were built, and that they were often built in river bottom areas, so places where it would be kind of boggy and wet, and not a place that's a very easy place to build something. So like if you build up a sand castle, the water will take it away. If you built something right next to a riverbank, a flood might come and get it. Like, these are not easy places to build, but these engineers, these Hopewell people, were genius at building these mountains.
Yeah.
It's so fascinating to learn about.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I read an article that was footnoted from The Dawn of Everything that was all about, it was called The Da Vinci's of Dirt. And it was all about, like, they're talking to other archaeologists, and they're like, we need to not be thinking about these things as just people dumping random baskets full of dirt into a mound shape. They were intentionally engineered with like alternating layers and stuff to withstand the test of time.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Hopewell mounds took lots of different forms. There were effigy mounds that were in certain shapes, and there were burial mounds, and also mounds that were associated with periodic ritual gatherings of people. And
some of them were lunar observatories, some of them were stellar observatories.
Almost always aligned with the heavens in one way or another.
Right. Yeah. So they were ritual spaces, often with like a big flat part that was maintained nearby. Yeah. Some of them for celestial observation, some of them to honor different animal spirits.
Right.
Or at least that's what it looks like, because they're effigies of animals often. But yeah, they're incredibly beautiful and such an interesting technology.
And they talk about how tokens indicating the clan that was responsible for the building of a certain mound would be buried in the mound.
Oh, right.
And so that has been very helpful to archaeologists who are trying to like map the social world of these people, because they're like, oh, this is like a bear clan. But yeah, their description of the Hopewell world, it's fascinating and sort of odd to picture. Because, so we've already talked about Poverty Point in the book, which also involves a lot of mounds. This is after that. Okay. Right? Poverty Point is older. This is after that. So this is a culture that reached, yes, it was centered in the Ohio Valley sort of culturally, but it was not anything like an empire. Right. And it wasn't like politically controlled from the center of the Ohio Valley or like anything like that. In fact, there's no evidence for political control at all. There's not a political center. It was decentralized, but it was a sphere of culture that reached, I'm not sure how far the whole thing reached, but it was like over a lot of the east of Turtle Island. But what's interesting about it is that these folks, these Hopewell folks, they didn't tend to live in towns. They lived in very small, the book calls them homesteads, like small communities of maybe like 8 or 10 people, family groupings kind of. And even though they had maize, they didn't intensify maize agriculture really at all, and just grew a little bit of maize, mostly for ceremonial purposes. Maize had recently arrived.
Right.
But what was cultivated instead was this group of native North American plants that were cultivated that was like, it's like one of the centers of original cultivation on the earth, where I can't remember, like, the names of the plants are not ones that are household names. It's like goosefoot and sumpweed and stuff. But there's like a grouping of them that were the original cultivars of Turtle Island before maize came up from the south, right? So they mainly grew these crops, hunted and gathered a lot, of course, had a little bit of maize, didn't live in towns, did not even congregate in the extra fertile like river bottoms. They lived more in higher elevations, had small gardens, didn't have a lot of interaction with each other because they didn't live in towns, except when they did, which were these big, like, ritual gathering occasions. That was what a lot of these mound complexes were made for. And so periodically, people would come out of their homesteads and they would congregate in the context of this shared culture where all the different clans had a role in the rituals that were happening. And there was like a shared world that they were a part of only periodically, kind of, because in the interim, they lived like loosely scattered over the land.
Yeah.
Did you get this impression from that?
Yeah.
Too?
And I just in case people aren't connecting the dots here, I wanted to say that Dave just named a lot of elements that would be preconditions for a grain state or empire emerging.
Right.
They're there, but they did not go that way. So to summarize, there was incredibly rich bottomlands that the cultures were sort of clustered around, but they didn't actually live there. They just came there for ritual purposes sometimes.
Right. Yeah.
They did cultivate maize. They understood how to grow grains, but they did not grow them en masse. They grew them just for ritual purposes. And then they created these earthworks together, so they had the capacity to organize big monumental projects.
And do collective labor. Yeah, right.
So we have all these little elements of
the ingredients
of the state are there for the grain state.
Yeah, for like a James C. Scott type grain state are there because there's like a calorie crop.
Yes.
Really rich land to grow on. And the capacity for collective labor. And so some vulgar determinists would just say, once these ingredients come together in the same place, you're just going to, have a state.
Right. Also, to point out that because these mountains were not only evidence of engineering genius, really, but they involved like advanced geometry and advanced astronomical knowledge to be able to situate them correctly and timing techniques for calendrical time. Yeah. That had to do with studying the heavens. Like they had all of these things we associate with empire, honestly.
Yeah. Or that we see a lot of evidence for in the context of empire.
Absolutely.
For sure. And we saw all that stuff at Poverty Point too.
Right.
Which was 1,000 years earlier.
Long time
or something,
ago
right? So in fact, they take a little bit of care to point out here that like the mathematical and geometric system that was used to construct and lay out the mounds in the Hopewell sphere, it's clear that they were descended from
the Poverty
basically
Point.
Using the same system that the Poverty Point constructors used as well. That was based on a certain way that you can break down a triangle geometrically.
Right.
Completely fascinating. But so there's a intellectual history just at the level of this geometry and astronomy.
Right.
That is in evidence here.
Wait, is this the part where they talk about the haircuts?
Yep.
So one thing that they point out here too, which is really interesting, so this is a culture that's like diffuse. And
every Hopewell person had a different hairstyle.
Like any descriptions or images, like there's just different. It's not like there are certain tribes in the Eastern Woodland world where you were everyone in the tribe would have the same haircut. That's how you'd be able to recognize someone from
the historical tribes.
The historical tribes.
Yes,
the historical tribes. You would be able to recognize someone from their haircut.
There was like an Oneida haircut and like a Mohawk haircut or something.
Clearly we know of the Mohawk haircut.
And you can recognize those people from afar by their tribal affiliation or something.
But the Hopewellian sphere of influence and interaction, everybody had a different haircut. Sounds like a lot of work.
Yeah.
To try to figure out how to have a different haircut, but there was a celebration of difference in the culture. Of course, the Davids love the celebration of difference.
The Davids are like, can you imagine the creative freedom available to these people who each had their own unique haircut?
Yeah.
Yeah. Because there's a lot of representation of people who lived back then. in pottery and things. And apparently there's like no two hairstyles are alike on all this pottery.
I mean, that is saying something.
Yeah. That's neat. And the main time of the Hopewell times that they're portraying for us here is, I have 100 BC to 500 AD, as Janet said. But then according to the Davids, starting around 400 AD, you start to see a transition. Mm-hmm. What they point out is that you see maize being grown as a staple more, and then more frequent armed conflict.
Right. And also people started to settle more, like around the earthworks.
Right. More permanent gathering around the earthworks instead of just being very dispersed and only coming to the places of the earthworks at the right times of year. Right. Yeah. So this was a period from like 400 to 800 AD, apparently, where it's kind of a transitional period, maybe, or at least it's a transition to what they want to talk about next. Right. So more maize, more armed conflict. So this, you might think already that these two features might be building towards different possibilities for power to consolidate.
We've got some
potentially
preconditions coming together.
The preconditions are coming in more strongly, maybe. Yeah. And then after that, they want to draw our attention to Cahokia.
Right. Well, so, because also part of what happened, within this transition is you start to see not only people settling more around the earthwork site, but also there start to be more concentrations of settlement in general. Like Hopewell sphere of influence was pretty diffuse and dispersed in settlement. But we're seeing like actually the emergence of like cities and larger groupings of people. And by the time Cahokia emerges, pretty large groups of people.
Pretty large groups of people. Yeah. And Cahokia was, am I right about this, that it potentially began as just kind of one of these mound
I think so.
Sites, congregation sites, but it pretty rapidly transitioned into like its own thing.
So what is Cahokia? Where is it?
Cahokia is a spot that it's near the Mississippi River in East St. Louis. Right. So across the Mississippi River from St. Louis on the eastern bank of the river is Cahokia. It's still there. You can go visit Cahokia. I haven't been there.
We might go in May.
Yeah. And the thing that people are probably most likely to know about Cahokia is that it became a very big city for its time.
Very big.
I think it's the biggest city to have ever emerged north of the Rio Grande in pre-Columbian America, right? The biggest city. And I believe that I read this somewhere that Cahokia at the time of its peak was a bigger city than London was. Wow. At that same time.
Oh, wow.
Like it had more people in it.
Right, because
big city.
They talk about in 1050 current era that there was a huge population explosion from the city of Cahokia, and that if you include the whole like sort of suburban area of the river bottom around there were actually like 40,000 people there.
Right.
Which is 40,000 people.
40,000 people in Cahokia and in this region that they call the American Bottom.
Yes, they do.
Which is like a river floodplain type of area of rich agricultural soils. Yeah, so Cahokia, the site has a prehistory before its emergence as this great city. But then, as Janet was saying, by about 1050, it just starts to really explode in size.
And we begin to see those telltale signs of the formation of empire.
Yeah, like what? What do we see?
well, we see violence. We see mass executions happening, especially on the occasions of the burials of nobles.
Yeah.
We see stratified hierarchical power systems.
Yeah, there was the inauguration of a certain type of mound building, these what are called platform mounds, where the mounds were flat on top, and then also the top of the mound, whatever was happening on the top of the mounds was reserved for the elites. So there was like an elite class, and it was from the top of the mounds that they conducted their elite roles in the society.
Well, which included surveillance. Like the mounds began to be used for surveilling the surrounding regions.
They used the word surveillance a couple of times on this one page, and I was like, that is really interesting that they're really emphasizing that the rulers could be on top of the mound, literally like watching over everybody.
Right.
And I don't know if they're just imagining that, if they're like imagining them surveilling them, or if there's like more direct evidence than just that. But yeah, there was a mound in the center. And one of the things so now you can hear the change in our language.
Right.
Cahokia is a site with rulers, with elites. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that they did was that they actually moved people somehow. I guess this was a coercive thing, but they moved people from the surrounding area. They broke up their settlements and communities and moved them into the city. Mm-hmm. It was kind of like they made them gather close around the city and its mounds. But yeah, I mean, the ritual sacrifice, that's a telltale thing. That's at least something to take note of. I read a whole account of what archaeology calls Mound 72, and there's 2 burials that are in that mound. One of them is, I think, 49 people who were killed at one time and buried at one time, and the other one is 30-something people who were also killed at one time and buried at one time. Right. And then there's even another burial in there, too. And so, the Davids are like, sounds like this is sort of falling into the template that we talked about in the last chapter of more kingdom type situations being inaugurated by an act of ritual violence.
Mm-hmm. There also is evidence of a rise in spectacular gaming, competitive games.
Yeah, there's a game element to all this too. Yeah.
Chunky.
Yeah, the game is called Chunky.
Yeah.
We probably don't have time to get into the chunky element of this in any detail, but they point out the similarity between the role of Chunky here and the role of the ball game when it was like the Mayans who were under consideration, particularly the Mayans, but other Mesoamericans as well. They theorized that maybe Cahokia was a second order regime. Right, because of charismatic politics that had to do with the game, that had to do with Chunky. And then, what was the other one?
The control of violence.
The control of violence, yes, right. So control of violence, right.
Yeah, so they're hypothesizing that Cahokia was emerging as a second order regime until things went in another direction.
Yeah. And Cahokia, the rise of Cahokia goes along with the rise of like an entire cultural and political pattern that spreads widely over the east of Turtle Island around this time, and which has been called the Mississippian culture. Cahokia is kind of in some ways like the capital of it, or like the center of it, the leader of it in some ways. But the Mississippian culture has mound-centered, platform mound, elite-controlled towns that operated in much the same way that Cahokia did, where they like resettled people closer to the center of the mound. They had a mound with the elites at the top. And these existed throughout the Southeast. Moundville in Alabama is one of these sites. The Etowah Mounds in northwestern Georgia is another major site, but there's a lot more than this. But what they say is that in the 11th and 12th centuries, Mississippian sites appear from Virginia all the way to Minnesota, and then, of course, in the southeast as well, and the deep south, so over a wide area. And it wasn't like everybody within that whole area was a Mississippian person or a Mississippian subject, but they dotted the landscape, and there were trade routes between them. And in some of these places, like at Etowah, archaeologists have found artifacts and ritual objects that came there from Cahokia. I don't know how they know this, but this is what it said. So in some very real way, Cahokia was participating in the lives of these communities. Cahokia itself was like supplying, the ritual gear that enabled the priestly elites to, lord over the folks who were there in some way. So this was like the height of Mississippian culture at its most like elite ruled and like hierarchical phase.
Right.
In Mississippian culture, there's a lot of features of the culture that we don't really have time to unpack here about the cosmology. The Mississippian culture was matrilineal. We could go on. But this phase of the Mississippian culture, where it was characterized by like a lot of little kingdoms and was very hierarchical, had its time, but then it too declined, as we're going to talk about. But some of the features, especially the cultural and mythological features of Mississippian culture have persisted to this day in the historical tribes of the Southeast, especially.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and also I did want to say that too, which is you're pointing to it, which is that though this is a story about power and resistance to power, that's what's being highlighted here.
Mm-hmm.
But it is true that that is one aspect of this culture at a certain time.
And, the Mississippian sites have left behind a fair amount for the archaeologist to dig through.
Right.
And so, this is a fairly well documented part of the Eastern Woodlands historical experience.
Right.
That happened for like a couple hundred years. 150, 200 years was this like peak of Mississippian power.
Mm-hmm. So Cahokia was a pretty active central point of settlement and power, like 1050 to 1350. But between 1350 and 1400, current era, there's evidence of kind of a mass like defection, like a mass migration away. People walk away from Cahokia.
Right.
And are able to walk away from Cahokia, which is important. The ability to leave is something that is one of the requirements of freedom, right?
Yeah, they somehow managed the ability to leave.
They managed to leave.
And the reasons are debated.
Yes.
I'm talking about by anthropology and historians and stuff. Like, there doesn't seem to be a consensus on what led to the downfall.
Which is also
of Cahokia.
kind of like the Mayan story.
Yeah.
We don't know exactly what happened.
Right.
There's a lot of conjecture. They're going to add to the conjecture here. But what is interesting that they talk about here is that a lot of the different descendants of this culture, or people who were Mississippian later on, often have metaphors for describing restructuring of social organization in terms of migration or leaving.
Yeah.
They talk about like leaving for another country when they're talking about, and then we started doing things differently. That's specifically an Osage saying, I think. Which is really cool. And then but they point this thing out where because of the fact that there was so much space, there's this expansive terrain all around. Power, it was not as easy for power to continue to be coagulate. There was this dissolution that would happen. Mm-hmm. And it was more likely to happen because there was space. And I love this idea that they give here, which is that like social movements during this time were like literally involved physical movement. Yeah, they're like, okay, we'll leave. Actually, these are not satisfactory conditions for life.
Right.
We're out of here.
Yeah.
And we can just go live well right over there, know?
And in the Osage example, like even maybe if it didn't involve physical movement, they use the language of physical movement to talk about it.
Totally.
So they're like, friends, it might be time for us to move to another country.
Right.
And you might not go anywhere, but you would just have like 2 months of meetings where you would reconstitute your people.
Totally.
And then you're like, now we live in another country.
Right. No. So this is such a cool and interesting idea. But one thing that we want to give the Davids credit for here right now is, we're always giving them a hard time about not acknowledging material conditions, but they do acknowledge some material conditions here, which is that part of the reason that people had the ability to reject this kind of power structure and to move on is that there's a large land mass. So it's not a concentrated group of people, but also like low population density in general. And within that, it's not this, having a low population density allows mobility, allows for expansion, but also there was a pretty low birth rate. And we'll talk about this some more towards the end as well. But what's interesting about that is that we see in cultures where there is a low birth rate, this is not always the case, but often women have more power and have more say over whether or not they are having children.
Yeah.
And when you have say over your own reproduction, then you're going to be able to be more mobile. You can get up and leave easier if you're not pregnant or about to have a baby or have a new baby. Yeah. If you don't have many children to care for, you are going to be more mobile and have more freedom.
Right.
And so the cultures that they're going to talk about who are able to change and do things differently often have that component. There is a freedom to having a low birth rate.
Right.
And a low population density.
Yeah.
Which I think is interesting, but also I'm grateful that they point out those as factors here.
Yeah, that's really cool. It's interesting that like control over one's own reproduction is usually going to look like limiting one's reproduction
yeah.
to somewhat less than it would be if men were just setting the pace of it or something, right? I mean, because that's kind of the implication, is that patriarchy sometimes wants women to be baby machines.
Right.
You know,
Right.
I guess especially if it's powered by a grain state or something like that too. I guess I shouldn't generalize because it depends on a lot of conditions. But
nomadic peoples tend to have less children.
Yeah.
But settled people often will want more children.
Right.
For defense and other reasons.
Yeah.
And for labor.
I'm glad that you brought up the material conditions, because it was, the picture that they're painting here is a rejection of Mississippian way of life. Mm. Even if there was some other dynamics that precipitated it or something, they say that there was a period of mass defection. Right. Where people who came under the sway of these rulers decided to leave, you know, and they point out, like, they're like, and they had the ability to, because there was lots of room. And they were people who more easily could get up and leave. Right. Yeah. One thing that's kind of interesting is that they talk about how the whole, not just the Cahokia site, but the whole area around it was abandoned for a really long time. Mm-hmm. It's been called the vacant quarter.
Yeah, it's really weird.
For a certain period in history, because it was almost like the impression that I think they mean to leave us with is that it was like a traumatic site that people didn't want to revisit. It took like generations before people considered settling there again.
Yeah. Well, they also talk about the fact that we don't even know the name of Cahokia, partially because, or the true name, the history of that place was erased from oral history. There's no record.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to be present in oral history of the descendants.
Even though there's descendants
of the people involved
all over the southeast and eastern woodland, possibly. Yeah. There's no record within the oral traditions of this place, which surely would have been somewhat monumental in the history of these folks, you know? Yeah. I mean, there is still traces of various parts of the cosmology and other parts of the culture, but not the story of the place.
The place.
You know?
Yeah, the place, right.
And I would like to, if anyone has more information about that, or I would love to learn more about that if there is, more to be said around it.
Yeah, it's the kind of thing that you get the feeling that there might be other views on that.
Totally.
But yeah, speaking of descendants, I mean, a lot of what the Davids do next, in the next pages after describing that Cahokia eventually collapsed and was deserted, was that this happened throughout the Mississippian sphere.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so not just Cahokia, but one after another.
All of the little kingdoms
kind of met resistance. It's hard to say exactly, but the rulers there were unable to maintain what they had built as far as this pretty structured hierarchical type of pattern that they had enjoyed for a few generations. And they track this through talking about the history of the Etowah River Valley in northwest Georgia, where they trace this through some generations up to and including the visit of Hernando de Soto in 1540 to that part, which we're not going to recount here. But they're basically, talking about how what you see following the collapse of Cahokia and the ensuing disintegration of this like height of Mississippian dominance is that you see that succeeding generations of men, it seems like to always have been men, who were trying to like have a little bit of political power, centralized power. As the generations go on, they were able to achieve less of it. Right. I mean, that's kind of, and whatever power and a little bit of a kingdom or a fiefdom these guys were able to pull together was like more ephemeral, more brittle, more possible of being overthrown until by the early 1700s, you basically have the dissolution of that entire way of doing things entirely. And people quit building platform mounds. You have the consolidation of the historical tribes that we know of in the Southeast.
Yes.
The Cherokee, the Creek, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Seminole, who maintained a somewhat Mississippian way of life in a lot of ways, but without that kind of power structure and without building any more of those platform mounds with the elites at the top. And I learned from actually some of my reading outside of the book, from the bibliography of the book, that like the actual existence of the mounds was sort of re-narrativized and they were given new significance, by the historical tribes, and kind of like, you might want to say, took away some of their power or something as relics of a more oppressive time.
Right.
Maybe. At least that interpretation is available. Maybe.
Right. Reframing them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And what the Davids want to say, and this is leading up to the indigenous critique and Kandiaronk, like we're getting there. But for right now, like we're still in the southeast. But that the tribes that the colonists came to know, the Creek, the Choctaw, the Cherokee, with their council halls and their assemblies and their like more democratic systems of governance were the result of this struggle to throw off and remake the Mississippian world into something more egalitarian and less conducive to people getting power over other people.
Right. Yeah, because they're going to give us a lot of examples of different cultures downstream from the height of the Mississippian hierarchy. Yeah. Although whether or not it's in direct lineage is part of what's debating. Going to be debatable about what they go into here. But they are going to give examples of cultures that still had a lot of Mississippian influence, had the cosmology, still had some ritual practices in place, but restructured their societies in ways that prevented abuse of power and often had mythos and lore and origin stories about how their societies would be structured in this way, or what happens when someone abuses power and how bad things happen to them.
Right.
Whether there's a lot of different ways this can look, and this part's worth you spending some time with and reading on your own instead of us summarizing it. It's going to be more interesting if you do that. Yeah,
for sure. So like the evidence that they want to point to is not just the history that can be pieced together from archaeology and everything, and how there were elites on platform mounds and then there weren't and all this stuff, but also the stories that you find in these cultures, the stories that you find, and they pull together some in more detail than others, but they pull together stories that are found in the Cherokee, that are found in the Osage, and that are even found in the Iroquois, which is where we end up at Kandiaronk, about a time when there was strife, or there was violence, or there was someone who was abusing power, and our world had to be reformed, or that had to be remedied in some way.
Yeah, actually, since we are on Cherokee territory, I was going to highlight, they give some Cherokee examples, and it's that within the Cherokee culture, at the point when this was all written down, there was a priest class still. There was still ritual knowledge. There was still some of the same ceremonies from the Mississippian heyday, but they had a governing body that was a council. And the council made decisions. The priests were not allowed to accrue power or consolidate power. They were not in charge. There probably were still some levels of hierarchy. We don't really know, but it wasn't anything like the level of domination that had pre-existed that. And they had and have stories that are about how bad things will happen to you if you have power over other people. And that's part of the lore. Yeah,
there's a story that James Mooney collected that has to do with an uprising against a bunch of power-abusing priest class people called the Anikutani, which I would like to read more about. That is a Cherokee story. Right. So they're like, at one point we had to, I think in the story they killed these guys. Right. Like we had to do away with these priests that had too much power.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So part of the point is they're like a lot of these cultures that are descendants of this Mississippian conglomeration have their own stories about how they come to share power. And part of the point here is they're like, this is a conscious decision. This is the process of creating a society together to be in a constant mode of co-creation in which you create structures that prevent people from abusing power.
Right.
And you do that with story, and you do that with governance, and with societal organization.
Exactly. Yeah. So to summarize, they're basically saying Cahokia and the whole Mississippian thing arose at a certain point. It was an oppressive system. It deteriorated for whatever reason, but then it looks like maybe the descendants and the people who were under its sway deliberately organized to try and make sure that type of thing wouldn't happen again.
Right.
That's their argument. They do say in here, as an aside, and it should be pointed out, because they're taking a little bit of a different tack than most of the historians of this stuff. What apparently most of the historians would point out, that a lot of these changes towards these different types of ways of holding power and social forms were also happening at a cataclysmic and really disruptive time post-contact, post-European contact, where disease was going through, colonization was starting to happen, the slave trade, like there were all kinds of disruptive influences that were happening very intensely at this time that formed an unignorable kind of part of the context for the reorganization of these people that were happening. Because part of this was happening before 1492, but a lot of it was happening after.
Right.
So the period that's being told here is like spanning that, And the Davids acknowledge that you can't really separate out this historical period from what was happening vis-a-vis colonization, but they also want to hold space for the fact that like these internal political conversations and processes of reorganization, these things were well underway already. Right. And there were signs that this was happening even before the massive disruption.
Yeah, one of the interesting, I think that is all very important to keep in mind the whole time we're talking about this. This is not happening in a vacuum.
Yeah.
Some of it happened before 1492, as you said, but some of it did not. But part of one of their examples of the power sharing or destabilizing of power, taking some of the power away from power, that they give an example of is in Creek culture, that instead of tobacco and the black drink, like yaupon, which we can talk about that in a moment, that the sort of sacramental substances, like the black drink and like tobacco, which had been formerly only used by spiritual leaders, by shamans, priest class type folks, that there was a sort of democratization where there would be these discussion halls where some of the decisions about the restructuring of society were happening, where everyone would be partaking of the caffeinated drink, the black drink, and would be smoking tobacco. It sounds like a coffee house, right? That's part of one of the jokes that they make in this part, is that it sounds a lot like an Enlightenment era coffee house in Europe, because by then coffee and tobacco had been exported to Europe. Not coffee from here, of course. Right. but yeah,
like you wouldn't go to a meeting to talk about matters of importance without smoking your tobacco pipe.
Totally. Yeah.
At a certain point.
Yeah.
But what preceded that was a time in the culture where specialized people would be consuming the tobacco only.
Right.
And it wasn't just available to everybody.
Yes.
Or even all the males.
Right.
It would just be specialists who would do it. So yeah, there's like, they're tracking this democratization process, and they're like, you even see it here
in the special substances,
in the drugs,
and for people who don't know, the black drink they're referring to is yaupon. It's or that's what it's called in the Southeast. I don't know actually what it's called everywhere, but it's a holly.
Ilex vomitoria.
Yeah, Ilex vomitoria, because people would drink it till they threw up for ceremonial purposes.
Yeah.
But it's a strongly caffeinated holly, like mate. Mate is also...
It's related to yerba mate.
Yerba mate is also a holly.
Yeah.
We have some of that around. We have friends that harvested some of that on the coast, Gulf Coast, and gave us some.
Yeah.
And we have picked some on the eastern coast, because it grows it grows in North Carolina as well.
Very common shrub on the coast.
Yeah, they're pretty cool. But also, just to point out, there's a plant that contains caffeine native to Turtle Island. I don't know if everyone knows that.
Yeah.
And yaupon is that plant. Yeah. I wanted to point out one thing here, and maybe we're going to talk about this at another time, but they are kind of doing this thing where they compare this democratization of these special substances to the Protestant Reformation. Did you catch this?
Yeah.
There's like a weird thing that happens here. Okay, this is a point of interest for me for many reasons, obviously, but they're like kind of comparing the decentralization of power here that is evidenced in sacramental plants being used by everybody instead of by special people to the Protestant Reformation, when the Bible was translated into English when the Catholic Church lost some of its power stranglehold on the populace and on nations, and as people rose up and claimed their Christianity for themselves. And then there's an overlap between the Protestant Reformation and the Enlightenment era and the restructuring of nations that happened in Europe at that point. And it's just another example of the funny times where the Davids seem to really just like relish in the Enlightenment and hold it up as this golden era of freedom. And we all went through the Caliban and the Witch together, so we know that we don't always feel that warm and fuzzy about the Enlightenment.
Yeah. Yes. I think about this all the time. I think about this all the time. And I mean, we could do a whole episode maybe about...
Maybe we'll. I mean, I probably don't want to do it now.
Thing where like, yeah, but you're totally right. It's like you would get the idea from this book, you know, if this book was your only source, that the Enlightenment was just full of totally reasonable, good ideas.
Yes. Yeah.
You know, and they're attributing a lot of these ideas to indigenous folks who they hold in high respect,
right,
high regard. Right. And so these good ideas that are the Enlightenment, we should think about where the origin of some of them is, you know, or at least one of the origins is. And that all makes sense. But we also know that part of what the Enlightenment was doing, the Enlightenment had a lot of different facets, obviously, but one of the facets is rationality,
right,
disenchantment, and the turning of like the world into like a thing.
Right.
As really beautifully analyzed in Caliban and the Witch, this was something that was maybe necessary to create the worldview and the ideology that would support capitalism.
Right.
And support like endless exploitation beyond what was possible in the feudal world. And so, you know, we're obviously not going to lay blame for that at Candiaronc's feet or something, right? But like, how do all of these ideas mix together? You know, I mean, I guess the short version of it is that there's good ideas and there's bad ideas in the Enlightenment. And even the good ideas were sort of distorted or made part of a terrible package by the needs of emerging capitalism. Right. And so it became, on the whole, an oppressive thing, a disenchanting thing, even though, yes, there are ideas about human rights and equality and freedom and stuff in it. Because of the needs of the capitalists, it became about the freedom of capital and the rationalist logic of the market system.
Right.
And so these ideas that seemed freeing kind of at the time instantaneously got put at the service of a machine for exploitation.
Yeah, and it's worth pointing out that whatever worthiness we might see, like I'm going to just return to the Protestant Reformation as part of this whole cycle or shift. Whatever we might think about the stranglehold of power that the Catholic Church had over Europe at that point, the Protestant participation and disenchantment is enormous.
Yeah.
The largest, the most significant witch burning that happened was not performed by the Catholic Church. It was often performed by Protestants, and often they were burning Catholics. They weren't even, that's who they were calling witches, you know. And so, just to say like that, I don't love the comparisons that are happening a little bit here. You know, from what we know, the Mississippian, the ways that the changes in societal structure in response to having lived under domination that they're proposing didn't reject the spiritual, did not reject an animist worldview. And although there might have been shared sacrament, instead of having a spiritual class who had more power, it didn't come with this wholesale thingification of the world. And there's a way in which the Protestant Reformation did actually incorporate some of those ideas, you know?
Yeah, they're kind of talking about maybe the more idealized side of it or something, right? Because the Reformation is about democratization of access to the spiritual material. Yes. Like we should all be able to read the Bible, right, and not just have the priests read it to us, right, and so forth. Right. And they're talking about kind of like maybe we all get to smoke the tobacco. Right. Yeah, they're drawing analogies. Maybe this is part of their wanting to say we all have social movements.
Right. Right.
You know, it has happened in Europe. The Reformation was one.
Right.
something that has some interesting potential overlap with some of the features of the Reformation could be seen in indigenous America.
Right.
You know, not to equate the two, or not to say that like the Protestant Reformation is therefore good in some big picture way, but just to show that social movements are a feature of humanity wherever, and contestation of like who gets access to esoteric knowledge and the tools of relationship with the divine is like a common point of contention in people all over the place. Is maybe what they're saying?
I think that is part of what they're saying, and yet also it feels like very much like the high school textbook version of the Protestant Reformation. You know, that's kind of ignoring some of the other power grabs that are happening, that it's a reconsolidation in favor of certain forms of power. You know, that without the backing of various princes and nobility, the Protestant Reformation couldn't even have taken wing, you know? Anyway, well, now I'm on history lesson time, but...
No, I know. I mean, I see what, you know, like you're reading this as the person who knows a lot more about the actual historical context of the Protestant Reformation, and so like sees it as part of a much more complicated dynamic of power, and not just for what it said it was about on the face of it. Which is what you're calling the high school textbook version.
I think that they also know more than the high school textbook version, though. I do think that that is true. Maybe we should come back to the Enlightenment stuff another time, Protestant Reformation stuff another time. It's just that they keep talking about the Enlightenment in this chapter in this way that is like sticking in my craw a little bit, you know?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, I have complicated questions about whether David Graeber sees a kind of like rational Enlightenment liberal subject, you know, a type of creature who we in European history think of as being like created at a certain point in time by the Enlightenment discourse. It's called the liberal subject. You can read whole textbooks about it. But he sort of sometimes seems to project liberal subjecthood onto every human that he finds in every time and place. And is like, these are all just
liberal subjects,
rational people or whatever who, And I don't know if that's 100% true about that, but it's a conversation that I would want to have with somebody, with people, with you maybe. But I don't know.
We might want to bring in someone else who knows better what he thought, actually. But I would love to if you know someone who's talked to Graeber about whether he sees the liberal subject everywhere, we would love to talk to them about that.
I think I've asked Google for...
Okay, so now we've talked about other stuff for so long. I don't know how much time we have for what's left in the chapter.
Jana's holding her head. She feels anxious about our time.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I should never have started talking about the Protestant Reformation, but...
No, it's good. It's all, we have to unpack all this stuff eventually.
Do we?
Do we?
I don't know. All right. Okay. We're going to reel it in. I'm only briefly going to mention something that's actually fascinating and that you should go and read in the book. And it's the section of the chapter on the Osage people. This is a very well documented culture. They're still around, of course. You know, there is a movie that came out about the Osage people in the past year, The Killers of the Flower Moon. But this is a culture that got to have like a pretty thriving trading empire, partially because they made an alliance with the French at a certain point. And so they kind of, you know, were allowed to participate and left alone, and they let the French come and do what they wanted to do. And so they thrived through a large part of the colonial history. And they were well documented. They had there was an ethnographer who spoke a similar language to theirs, who really recorded beautifully the stories of the Osage people and their ways of doing things. Now, the ways of doing things and some of their lore is part of what the Davids go over here, and this is what I want you to go look at. But I will just say that they have a very, very intricate system of organization that's so intricate that it actually requires a couple of diagrams for how decisions are made. And
I love a diagram.
Yeah, it's a beautiful diagram.
It's very cool.
What page is it on?
477.
477. And they have a very intricate clan system. They have a well-defined and... 4 directions plus sky and earth. Like all of these are recombined in all these ways. In all these different combinations. And there's a beautiful philosophical tradition with many layers. And some of what you find in the lore here which is what the Davids are pointing to, is that stories of arbitrary power being abused and those people being removed.
Because the system is a system for decision making.
Yes.
And it's a system of self-governance.
It's a system of decision making that prevents the abuse of power.
Yeah.
And the story of how they came upon this very intricate and complicated system is a long and sprawling story with many iterations that refers to one shift and change after another. Mm-hmm. And
it's rare to have a story in this much detail.
Yes.
That we have this story in. And so they basically tell the story of a series of constitutional crises, like basically, where they have to remake their culture once and it didn't quite work, and then again and it still didn't quite work, and again and it still didn't quite work. And each time they say that they had to move to another country.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah. And also to point out here, these folks had a very well thought out, reasoned, documented discussion of power relations and how to make sure that people don't get too powerful within a group. Mm-hmm. And one part of the point of this section is that there is a lot of overlap between the record of their thinking around all of this and some of what we see, again, in Enlightenment era political thought, including the work of Montesquieu. And while a lot of people think that maybe he was one of the originators of thinking about political systems and sharing power and how to prevent abuse of power, there's a lot of similarities between the Osage people's oral tradition, which was recorded by an ethnographer, and these ideas as written down in the Enlightenment by certain thinkers. And part of what the Davids are pointing out here is that we have a bias, or that we are taught a bias, that if people don't have a written literature or a philosophy, that they can't actually evolve complicated thinking and complex thinking about systems, that it requires written tradition and response to writing over time to actually develop those kinds of complex philosophies.
Right.
Yet they have them, and they have them in an oral tradition that happens to have been recorded. But as the Davids are pointing to here, that's probably true of all kinds of people.
Yeah, right.
You don't have to actually have a written literature to develop ideas.
Right. And just to be clear, the parallel that they're drawing between Montesquieu and the Osage is that the social structure and the decision-making process of the Osage people was obviously designed.
Right.
Right. It was designed by the people in these processes that are alluded to in their story here.
Right.
And that is noteworthy because historically you could find a lot of anthropologists or people who engage with indigenous people, prehistoric people or whatever, who assume that their social structures just kind of happened.
Totally. Yeah.
Of course, social structures formed, but the assumption would not be because the people designed it that way. The assumption would be that it was kind of thrust upon them by circumstance in one way or another, you know, and they're like, in the Western tradition, I guess the canon of Western history, it's at this time in Europe, Montesquieu and people like that start actually like thinking about the design of a society as something you could consciously like work on and perfect using like rational thought, you know, and they're like, well, the Osage were doing this, you know, and also the Osage went to Europe and Montesquieu maybe met them. So maybe there was actually a point of connection there, you know. And just to be clear about one more thing, because this is also going to be true of the Iroquois story that we're going to get to next, that the story of the constitutional crises and having to like reform the society over and over is told in a way that feels a little bit like a mythological story. You know, it's about that there was a people in their web of relations who were in this book are called the isolated earth people that were just found in a abject state. They had all this magical power, but they were abusing it. And they had to be like integrated into society and that it required all of these sort of constitutional reformations in order to do it. You know, so there's a mix. It is clearly documenting a historical process, but it's worded more in kind of a language of myth.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yes. And they're arguing, and I agree with this completely, that we should be able to look at myth and story in these oral traditions to talk about how people organize themselves. That this is part of our evidence and this is part of our this is part of what can elucidate our understanding.
Yeah, it's part of the meaning that we can find in these stories.
Yeah.
For sure. So, the last leg of the journey that leads full circle back to Kandiaronk takes us to Haudenosaunee land, the League of Five Nations. This was not an area that was Mississippianized to any large degree.
Mm-hmm.
So, unlike the people of the Southeast, where they were reforming and remaking themselves, as direct descendants of the Mississippian chiefdoms, or whatever you want to call them, kingdoms. These are folks whose connection to the Mississippian world was a little more tangential.
Mm-hmm.
However, there's a case that's made in here that prior to the League of Five Nations in the Iroquoian extended sphere, that there was a connection to some folks in the Ontario area where the Mississippian culture had an influence. So they do kind of try and tie it in. But there's a story, or a number of stories really, because there's different versions of the foundation of the League of the Five Nations. The Five Nations being the Seneca, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Mohawk. And that this story is in the form of an epic called the Guyana-Shagawa, or it's also sometimes called the Great Law of Peace. And basically, not to take too much time with it, but what we have in the Guyana-Shagawa is a story that's not unlike what we've heard in the Osage story. There's a story about like a scary, abusive, powerful figure known as Adodaro, who needs to be brought back into society. And what the Davids are kind of suggesting is that Adodaro may be similar to the, quote, isolated earth people of the Osage story, is kind of a allegory for like a king or like a priest who tries to take too much power for himself, that points to like actual historical kings or people who had taken too much power. And the story is kind of like the, I don't want to say taming, but like it's kind of the taming, because through the process, Adodaro becomes like humanized in a way to where he can like just be one of
integrated,
the true people and behave well, And the Guyana-Shagawa is the story of the negotiations, and the work that went into this creation. And it's through this act where Adodaro was kind of brought in and rehabilitated that the League was constituted. And the League of Five Nations was constituted very explicitly, and the democratic governance within that league is very well documented, and in fact famously inspired the American Constitution. So that's like just the very short version.
And part of what they're trying to tie together here, and I'm afraid we might not have made this clear when we talked about the Creek and the Osage, is that in all of these cultures that they're delineating, including in the Iroquoian zone with the League of Five Nations, in all of these cultures, as long as there's been documentation since European contact, there is a robust practice of debate, a robust practice of looking at things as a group, talking about them, and making decisions together.
Yeah, right.
And it's
kind of the design element.
That's the design element.
But through debate,
conversation.
Through conversation.
Through conversation. Yes. And the point of all of this is they're like, okay, so we have all these different cultures with different stories about abuse of power and mythic treatments of how to deal with people who abuse power.
Yeah.
And then we have all of these examples of people who have created elaborate structures to prevent domination and hierarchy.
Accumulation of power.
Yes. And they're like, this is not an accident.
Yeah.
And what they're saying, which maybe this is the part that could be debatable, is that it is through having interfaced with an empire such as Cahokia was beginning to be.
Yeah.
Through seeing this abuse of power, through seeing hierarchical forms of domination in one of those little kingdoms.
Yeah.
That people had an idea of what they did not want to be and what they wanted to keep from emerging.
Right. Yeah, which maybe they already had some idea because the potentials for accumulation of power are never totally absent.
Exactly.
But they had a very present and stronger idea.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what they're saying.
Yes.
It's true. They do bring up, like, this actually hadn't occurred to me when I was reading the book, but they're like, there's an obvious objection here where a lot of people will say, well, some of these people's constitutions and their ideas about the right way to be may have been formed in reference to the Europeans.
Mm-hmm.
Because, the Europeans were there starting in the 1500s.
Right.
And there was time for them to, like, develop these ideas. But they're like, we don't think it's that simple.
And I think they partially are pointing to the mythic stories, which are older.
Right.
To say that.
The League potentially predates colonization. We're not sure about that, it seems like. But yeah.
Okay. One thing I did want to point out here that they point to with the Iroquoian story is that from, like, 1230 to 1375, the Iroquoian people began to incorporate maize cultivation more into their culture.
Yeah.
And including, like, the practice of growing the three sisters together. So, like, the beans, corn, squash pattern.
Mm-hmm.
But the Iroquoian peoples were very careful to balance those new ways of being with hunting and foraging.
Mm-hmm.
As if they kind of understood that relying largely on agriculture came with some other things. They were definitely wary of relying too much on agriculture or having agriculture be the center of their culture.
Yeah.
And transitioning to that. And part of what I found so fascinating about this section is that they talk about how, and this came up earlier too, but the Iroquoian women, all of the different European folks who wrote about them talked about how they were able to space out their births. They had awareness of fertility awareness techniques and
this part,
and possibly, whatever. I could conjecture some other things about this, but we can say that they had control of their rate of birth, and that the Iroquoian women would time their birth and amount of children that they had to match the game populations.
Right.
To match what was available in the wild, because folks might not know this, but often, like, deer populations have kind of like a boom and bust type cycles.
Mm-hmm.
Some years are good for fishing, some years are not. And the Iroquoian women would basically keep the birth rates low and decide how much they wanted to reproduce. And that, as we mentioned earlier, having a low birth rate allows for more mobility. Generally, women have more power, political power in cultures where there's a lower birth rate.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a kind of a chicken and the egg thing. But the women are notably powerful in the Iroquoian culture.
Right.
And so I just find this whole part.
Well, and it allowed them to not rely too much on maize.
On maize, absolutely.
Which, I thought that was super fascinating part where they were like, hunting and foraging is really important to us culturally.
Yes.
And if we expanded our population too much, then it would have less of a role in our lives because we would have to rely more on maize and farming to support a big population. Mm-hmm. But if we keep our population low, then we can maintain this large role for hunting and foraging,
right? Which
was important to them culturally.
Yeah.
And so just the tie-in between these material considerations and the cultural importance of hunting, right, and also kind of derailing just the expansion of maize as an end in itself or whatever, just because you can. All of those being interconnected, I think, is really neat.
Well, yeah, and it's interesting because keeping hunting and foraging central prevented what often happens when agriculture becomes dominant, which is the denigration of women.
Yeah.
Because the caloric abundance can often lead to population booms, but at the same time, women are more likely to be turned into just baby-making machines in agriculturally based societies, And one of the things that I think is interesting here, and you just have to wonder how much all of this was part of the debate that was happening, because there is actually evidence in this chapter that there was a pretty big conflict over which way to go here for these people. One thing that we see in cultures that tend to become more and more hierarchical, these grain states, the cultures that turn into empire, is that women lose status.
Mm-hmm.
And so as people are debating the pros and cons of different pathways, the status of women is very central to this discussion.
Right.
And there's evidence of that in a lot of these different cultures that they talked about what would happen to women.
Yeah.
And women are part of these conversations.
Yeah.
And so to me, there's a recognition that they understood that patriarchy's at the door. You know, they're like, yeah, no, we're going to keep things like this. We're going to have control over the babies. And as they're debating which way to go, this is part of what they're thinking. They see abuse of power come with patriarchal forms.
You're right.
You know, and they're arguing against all of that. And that is part of what is on the floor of the debate, right?
Yeah. You can basically track shifts in power structure, power, and domination through time just by following the status of women.
Absolutely.
It almost tells the whole story sometimes.
One could argue.
It feels like it
one
does
could
sometimes.
argue that, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is where this ends, this chapter. Ends full circle. I mean, there's more that we didn't tell about like how Candiaronk himself might have actually gotten a hold of some of these ideas and his own, you know, but basically by bringing it to the Iroquoian world, we are basically bringing it back to Candiaronk. So they are saying this is why Candiaronk was so insightful about European hierarchy and domination culture. They had already been thinking about this stuff for a long time and talking about it and forming their societies against exactly that type of thing.
Taking steps to
exploitation.
Prevent it. Yeah.
That's the argument. I want to ask you what you think about a kind of maybe somewhat obvious objection that's been raised to what the Davids are doing in this chapter. All of this, besides explaining why Candiaronk might have had those ideas, there's also another purpose to what the chapter is doing, right? It's part of the question of inevitability, you know, and they're like, well, maybe this drive towards just grain states increasing and taking more territory and stuff is disproved now as an inevitable thing because we can go over here and we can see how that maybe started to happen, but then
it fell apart.
And people like took steps to remake their lives in opposition to that. But the objection that's been raised as far as like this actually being a proof or like a disproof or whatever, however you want to frame it, is that in the timeline that we're talking about here, the fall of Cahokia being about 1350, that what's to say that what we're seeing here is not just something akin to one of these like intermediary periods or dark ages or whatever that you find all throughout the Eurasian continent and experience.
So that if there had not been colonization, conquest, would there maybe just have been another empire emerge? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's what's implied is that we don't know what would have happened in the like self-determining history of Turtle Island because colonization happened. And that just threw everything. But we know from Eurasian history that the timeline of these areas of urbanization and hierarchy is totally dotted with these intermediary periods or periods of more egalitarianism, periods where the stuff falls apart, but then it comes back. And so are we actually telling a different story of a different pattern? How can we even know?
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's interesting. There is the like spaciousness that makes me wonder, like, is it possible if there's places to go that where you can get out of the grasp of empire, that you're going to be more likely to have longer periods between the emergence of empire? That seems possible to me. But
I'm not a fan of this objection personally.
It doesn't.
I find it tiresome. It kind of makes me, I don't know. I am interested in exploring alternative paths for history. And this is like a documented movement of people in a certain self-conscious direction. And although I see the logic in that objection, I'm not drawn to it.
Well, even if you say that maybe it's very possible that the freedom from empire was not going to be permanent, that doesn't make it less exciting or worth talking about. And maybe we could even say
that we don't know
that the different conditions on Turtle Island, material and spiritual, philosophical, created somewhat resistant forms that might have made it harder for empire to emerge. You know?
It's there for our imagination to seize upon. I admire what this chapter has done as far as like trying to get us to see how a different course can be charted collectively by diverse people in the direction of instituting and even codifying a relatively anti-authoritarian way of life.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think that might feel like a more substantial critique to me, or I don't know. I guess I don't know if I think you have to have experienced empire to try to prevent power from accumulating.
Right.
And I don't maybe need to know that the Iroquoian peoples didn't like Cahokia.
Yeah, I mean, it makes a tidy story.
Yeah.
Right. It makes a tidy story and maybe a tempting story for them. But you're saying, I mean, it does like reinforce the narrative.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
It does reinforce the narrative. I'm just saying that cultures all over the world have created structures to prevent the accumulation of power. Yeah, right. And some of them never came into contact with empire.
Yeah, that's true.
You know?
Yeah, right. Yeah, so there's like a tit for tat kind of element that maybe we don't have to think that that's necessary, you know? But I guess part of the story is that it has to do with maize. It has to do with cereal agriculture. Right. And so these were people who maybe, this isn't said explicitly, but it's definitely suggested by the storytelling in the chapter, is that these are people who experienced one possibility of grain agriculture introduction and then took steps, like you were just talking about with the birth rate and stuff like that, to limit its impact. So it's not just about deciding to live an anti-authoritarian way, but it's about adapting to a potentially disruptive material input, material change. Right. In this sense, it's kind of a material chapter.
It is.
Because it is about people who lived through the wave of maize introduction.
Right.
And then were able to, after like a brief period of semi-grain states, were able to coexist with it in like a more egalitarian way.
Yeah, the way that if we use like the determinist ways of thinking about grains, like they didn't allow the grain to domesticate them.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. I guess I hadn't really totally unpacked that dimension of the story until just now talking to you about it. That's interesting. That it is about the arrival of grain.
Yeah. A
little bit. And the ripple effects through the continent.
Right.
Cool. All right, that's the book, folks.
No, that's not the book.
I mean, what's left is the conclusion.
What happened is the conclusion, but we're going to have some guests on an episode soon.
We're planning on it. Yeah, we're working on it. We're working on having some guests. We'll keep their identities.
Yeah, secret for now.
A secret for now. But some friends on to talk about stuff from this very chapter.
Yes.
Like to go back over some of what we've just recounted and maybe like unpack it, different perspectives on it.
Yeah.
Which I'm excited to do. And we will do an episode on the conclusion and we'll see what else.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then we'll have a party.
Woo, will we ever? See you next time.
Bye.